David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, Chapter 39, Wickfield and Heep. My aunt, beginning, I imagine, to be made seriously uncomfortable by my prolonged dejection, made a pretense of being anxious that I should go to Dover and see that all was working well at the cottage, which was let, and to conclude an agreement with the same tenant for a longer term of occupation. I fell rather willingly into my aunt's pretense, as a means of enabling me to pass a few tranquil hours with Agnes. I found everything to be in a satisfactory state at the cottage, and was enabled to gratify my aunt exceedingly by reporting that the tenant inherited her feud and waged incessant war against donkeys, having settled the little business I had to transact there, and slept there one night. I walked on to Canterbury early in the morning. It was now winter again, and the fresh, cold, windy day and the sweeping download brightened up my hopes a little. Arrived at Mr. Wickfield's house, I found, in a little lower room on the ground floor where Uriah Heep had been of old accustomed to sit, Mr. Micawber playing his pen with great assiduity. He was dressed in a legal-looking suit of black, and loomed burly and large in that small office. Mr. Micawber was extremely glad to see me. He told me that he had become the tenant of Uriah Heep's old house, and that Mrs. Micawber would be delighted to receive me once more under her own roof. "It is humble," said Mr. Micawber, "to quote a favourite expression of my friend Heep, but it may prove the stepping stone to move ambitious domicility accommodation." I asked him whether he had reason so far to be satisfied with his friend Heap's treatment of him. He got up to ascertain if the door were closed shut before he replied in a lower voice, "My dear Copperfield, the man who labours under the pressure of pecuniary embarrassment is, with the generality of people, at a disadvantage. That disadvantage is not dimmed when the pressure necessitates the drawing of stipendiary emoluments before those emoluments are strictly due and payable. All I can say is that my friend Heep has responded to appeals, to which I need not more particularly refer, in a manner calculated to rebound equally to the honour of his head and of his heart." "I should not have supposed him to be very free with his money either," I observed. "Pardon me," said Mr. Micawber with an air of constraint. "I speak of my friend Heep as I have experience." I am glad your experience is favourable," I returned. "You are very obliging, my dear Copperfield," said Mr. Micawber, and hummed a tune. "Do you see much of Mr. Wickfield?" I asked, to change the subject. "Not much," said Mr. Micawber, slightingly. "Mr. Wickfield is, I dare say, a man of excellent intention, but he is, in short, he is obsolete." "I am afraid his partner seeks to make him so," said I. "My dear Copperfield," returned Mr. Micawber, after some uneasy evolutions on his stool, "allow me to offer a remark. I am here in a capacity of confidence. I am here in a position of trust. The discussion of some topics, even with Mrs. Micawber herself, so long as the partner of my various vicissitudes, and a woman of remarkable lucidity of intellect, is, I am led to consider, incompatible with the functions now devolving on me. I would therefore take the liberty of suggesting that in our friendly intercourse, which I trust will never be disturbed, we draw a line. On one side of the line," said Mr. Micawber, representing it on his desk with the office ruler, "is the whole range of human intellect, with a trifling exception on the other. Is that exception, that is to say, the affairs of Messrs. Wickfield and Heep, with all belonging and appertaining thereunto. I trust I give no offence to the companion of my youth in submitting this proposition to his cooler judgment." Though I saw an uneasy change in Mr. Micawber, which sat tightly on him, as his new duties were a misfit, I felt I had no right to be offended. My telling him so appeared to relieve him, and he shook hands with me. "I am charmed, Copperfield," said Mr. Wickfield. "Let me assure you with Miss Wickfield. She is a very superior young lady of very remarkable attractions, graces, and virtues. Upon my honour," said Mr. Micawber, indefinitely kissing his hand, bowing with his genteelest air, "I do homage to Miss Wickfield. Hem! I am glad of that, at least," said I. If you have not assured us, my dear Copperfield, if you had not assured us, my dear Copperfield, on the occasion of that agreeable afternoon we had the happiness of passing with you, that D was your favourite letter, said Mr. Micawber, I should unquestionably have supposed that A had been so. We have all some experience of a feeling that comes over us occasionally of what we are saying and doing having been said and done before, in a remote time of our knowledge, perfectly what will be said next, as if we suddenly remembered it. I never had this mysterious impression more strongly in my life than before he uttered those words. I looked into the room still belonging to Agnes, and saw her sitting by the fire. At a pretty old-fashioned desk she had, writing. My darkening the light made her look up. What a pleasure to be the cause of that bright change in her attentive face, and the object of that sweet regard and welcome. Ah, Agnes, said I, when we were sitting together side by side, I have missed you so much lately. Indeed, she replied, again, and so soon. I shook my head. I don't know how it is, Agnes. I seem to want some faculty of mind that I ought to have. You were so much in the habit of thinking for me in the happy old days here, and I came so naturally to you for counsel and support that I really think I have missed acquiring it. Her head was bent down, looking at the fire. It's the old story, said I. Don't laugh when I say it was always the same in little things as in the greater ones. My old troubles were nonsense, and now they are serious, but whenever I have gone away from my adopted sister, Agnes looked up with such a heavenly face and gave me her hand, which I kissed. Whenever I have not had you, Agnes, to advise and approve in the beginning, I have seemed to go wild and to get into all sorts of difficulty. When I have come to you, at last, as I have always done, I have come to peace and happiness. I come home now, like a tired traveller, and find such a blessed sense of rest. In her placid, sisterly manner, with her beaming eyes, with her tender voice, and with that sweet composure which had long ago made the house that held her quite a sacred place to me, she soon led me on to tell all that had happened since our last meeting. And there is not another word to tell, Agnes, said I, when I had made an end of my confidence. Now my reliance is on you. But it must not be on me, Trotwood, returned Agnes with a pleasant smile. It must be on someone else. On Dora, said I. Assuredly. I felt so grateful to Agnes and admired her so. I saw those two together in a bright perspective, such well-associated friends, each adoring the other so much. What ought I to do then, Agnes? I inquired, after looking at the fire a little while. What would it be right to do? I think, said Agnes, that the honourable course to take would be to write to those two ladies. Don't you think that any secret course is an unworthy one? Yes, if you'd think so, said I. I am poorly qualified to judge such matters, replied Agnes, with a modest hesitation. But I certainly feel that your being secret and clandestine is not being like yourself. Like myself is too high opinion you have of me, Agnes, I am afraid, said I. Like yourself in the candour of your nature, she returned, and therefore I would write to those two ladies. I would ask their permission to visit sometimes at their house, considering that you are young and striving for a place in life. I think I would be well to say that you would readily abide by any condition they might impose upon you. I would not be too vehement, said Agnes gently, or propose too much. I would trust my fidelity and perseverance, and to Dora. I had no longer any doubt on the subject. With a lightened heart, through with a profound sense of weighty importance on my task, I devoted the whole afternoon to the composition of the draft of this letter, for which great purpose Agnes relinquished her desk to me. But first I went downstairs to see Mr. Wickfield and Uriah Heep. I found Uriah in possession of a new plaster-smelling office, built out in the garden, looking extraordinarily mean in the midst of a quantity of books and papers. He received me in his usual fawning way and pretended not to have heard of my arrival from Mr. Micawber, a pretense I took the liberty of disbelieving. He accompanied me into Mr. Wickfield's room, which was the shadow of its former self, having been divested of a variety of conveniences, for the accompaniment of the new partner, and stood before the fire, warming his back and shaving his chin with his bony hand, while Mr. Wickfield and I exchanged greetings. "You stay with us, Trotwood? Will you remain in Canterbury?" said Mr. Wickfield, not without a glance at Uriah for his approval. "Is there room for me?" said I. "I am sure, Master Copperfield, I should say Mr., but the other comes so naturally," said Uriah. "I would turn out of your old room with pleasure, if it would be agreeable." "No, no," said Mr. Wickfield. "Why should you be inconvenienced? There is another room, there's another room." "Oh, but you know," returned Uriah with a grin, "I should really be delighted." To cut the matter short, I said I would have the other room, or none at all, so it would be settled that I should have the other room, and take my leave of the firm until dinner. I went upstairs again. I had hoped to have no other companion than Agnes, but Mrs. Heep had asked permission to bring herself and her knitting near the fire in that room, on pretence of its having an aspect more favourable to her rheumatics. I made a virtue of necessity, and gave her a friendly salutation. "I'm humbly thankful to you, sir," said Mrs. Heep, in acknowledgment of my inquiries concerning her health. "But I'm only pretty well. I haven't much to boast of. If I could see my Uriah well settled in life, I couldn't expect much more, I think. How do you think my Uri's looking, sir?" I thought him looking as villainous as ever, and I replied that I saw no change in him. "Oh, don't you think he's changed?" said Mrs. Heep. "There I must humbly beg to differ from you. Don't you see a thinness in him?" "Not more than usual," I replied. "Don't you, though?" said Mrs. Heep. "But you don't take notice of him with a mother's eye." His mother's eye was an evil eye to the rest of the world, I thought, as it met mine. Howsoever affectionate to him, I believe she and her son were devoted to one another. It passed me, and went on to Agnes. "Don't you see a wasting and a wearing in him, Miss Wickfield?" inquired Mrs. Heep. "No," said Agnes, quietly pursuing the work on which she was engaged. "You are too solicitous about him. He is very well." Mrs. Heep, with a prodigious sniff, resumed her knitting. She never left off, or left us for a moment. I had arrived early in the day, and we still had 3 or 4 hours before dinner. But she sat there, plying her knitting needles, as monotonously as an hourglass might have poured out its sands. At dinner she maintained her watch with the same unwinking eyes. After dinner her son took his turn, and when Mr. Wickfield himself and I were left alone together, leered at me and writhed until I could hardly bear it. In the drawing-room there was the mother, knitting and watching again. It was evident to me that this was the duty assigned to her. This lasted until bedtime. To have seen the mother and son like 2 great bats hanging over the whole house, and darkening it with their ugly forms, made me so uncomfortable that I would rather have remained downstairs, knitting and all, than gone to bed. I hardly got any sleep. Next day the knitting and watching began again, and lasted all day. I had an opportunity of speaking to Agnes for 10 minutes. I could barely show her my letter. I proposed to her that she walk out with me, but Mrs. Heep, repeatedly complaining that she was worse, Agnes charitably remained within to bear her company. Toward the twilight I went out by myself, musing on what I ought to do, and whether I was justified in withholding from Agnes any longer what Uriah Heep had told me in London, for that began to trouble me again very much. I had not walked out far enough to be quite clear of the town, upon the Ramsgate Road, where there was a good path, when I was hailed through the dust by somebody behind me. The shambling figure, the scanty greatcoat, were not to be mistaken. I stopped, and Uriah Heep came up. "Well," said I. "How fast you walk," said he. "My legs are pretty long, but you've given them quite a job." "Where are you going?" said I. "I am coming with you, Master Copperfield, if you'll allow me the pleasure of a walk with an old acquaintance," saying this with a jerk of his body which might have been either proprietary or derisive, he fell into step beside me. "Uriah," said I civilly as I could after a silence. "Master Copperfield," said Uriah, "to tell you the truth, at which you will not be offended, I came out to walk alone because I have had so much company." He looked at me sideways and said with his hardest grin, "You mean mother?" "Why, yes, I do," I said. Or said I. "Ah, but you know we're so very humble," he returned, "and having such knowledge of our own humbleness, we must really take care that we're not pushed on the wall by them as isn't humble. All stratagems are fair in love, sir." Raising his great hands until they touched his chin, he rubbed them softly and softly chuckled, looking like a malevolent baboon, I thought, as anything human could look. "You see," he said, hugging himself in that unpleasant way and shaking his head at me, "you're quite a dangerous rival, Master Copperfield. You always was, you know." And there we will pause.